Not really, but as the bigger man of the two of us, then why not? So, firstly, welcome to the show, whatever the show is, whatever the show's going to be called.
I guess that's what we're here to find out, eh?
Well, if we don't know it by the end, we'll know it by the time that this reaches the masses out there. So, my name's Brad, Bradley. As the accent may suggest, I'm based in the UK. And I'm joined by my other good friend, who's also Brad.
Hello, everyone. I'm also Brad. A couple of Brads here. As the accent may or may not give away, from Canada, although I'm currently based in Germany. So I guess I'll bring a sort of a North American perspective transplanted to Europe. A fish out of water, we'll say, in that sense. But I bring that aspect to the show. And what do you say, Brad? I mean, we got together, decided to, we fancied ourselves a couple of interesting dudes with some pretty strong opinions about things, and thought, hey, why not broadcast this to the masses?
Oh, I think there's also some evidence that suggests we fancy each other. So, we shouldn't hide behind that.
No, we won't. Us Brads stick together.
Yeah, not literally, although it has been known at times. So, for those of you that don't have the benefit of being in the room with either of us, we're actually doing this via the medium of technology. So I'm actually staring down a screen, making use of video conferencing, so I can see Canadian Brad, or Flash, as I may refer to him. And I can. You've got the nickname Flash, but I know I was the one that gave it to you, but I cannot remember why.
You know what? That whole first meeting was a bit of a haze, so I'm not sure I quite remember either. But the name surely has stuck. I didn't think it would. I didn't think it would stick, but this little circle of common friends that you and I share have really, they've not let it go. So Brad or Flash it is, and, I guess if we ever need to distinguish between the two of us, there we go.
Yeah, well, we could rely on our good looks. Obviously, that would distinguish amongst us. I'll leave that to the listeners to decide. But I think we both have a voice for radio, or a face for radio.
Yeah, so. Yeah. Well, we could, if it ever gets to that, and we get some feedback from anyone who might be listening to this, we could do the old. If you think your ego can handle it, we could put out the pictures and say vote.
Yeah, let's move on, shall we?
I think that's as good a segue as any to discuss what it is we want to talk about here. I think, like we said, fancied ourselves a couple guys with opinions and whatnot. For me personally, I mean, whether it's the news, political news, or, I'm really into science. I have a science background, so, whether it's politics or science or any of these topics that are in, I think we're living in a very interesting time, especially politically. But that's sort of the things that I enjoy talking about, and I've always enjoyed speaking with you about it, not only for the different perspective of us having grown up on different continents, but also just you're a pretty smart guy yourself and have interesting takes on most of these things.
Well, it could be a lot worse. We could be in the US right now, facing down the barrel of Donald Trump as our next president.
I was, we would be fools not to, I guess, start with this. It's seemingly the topic that has the whole world buzzing, and rightly so. It's when I said we were living in interesting times, this is basically what I meant. I was commenting to my girlfriend Teresa the other day, just with
I like the way you're clarifying you have a girlfriend, just with some of the chat that we had earlier.
Yeah, we're just dropping it in there, if she does exist. Yeah.
Nobody's ever seen her.
Yeah, I was commenting with Teresa, if she does exist, that this is, like, I've never in my life felt a political tension, like a global political tension. Like I imagine people that lived through the Cold War would have something like this, like I remember my dad's stories of I remember when we had to hide under the desks, for bomb drills and, just,
duck and cover.
Yeah, just that heightened tension sort of in the world. And I mean, I don't think we're at Cold War level yet. Maybe we are, and we just as a people, as a generation now, don't recognize how close we are. That's one way, but I honestly don't think we are at that level yet. But it is something, like I've never experienced this in my life, and with the recent events in the U.S., this shooting, this another terrible mass shooting, and the rhetoric that is now coming out of the Republican nominee for president, it's frightening stuff.
Although I'm slightly surprised in the way that actually he seems to be towing more of a political line. I half expected him to come out and start just bombing people.
Really?
Yeah, just because that's the impression he's given. This is the guy that we're going to give nuclear launch codes to. But he actually does, he's come out with a few wild and wacky things, but he actually seems to be trying to be a politician about this, which I find incredible that he's actually started kowtowing to some of that, but still very scary, the fact that ultimately he's there. Is that
your phone or your doorbell?
I think it was my doorbell. Let me go and see what that is.
Take a minute and we'll be right back. All right, you got the doorbell answered. Everything's squared away. That just shows you how professional our system here is.
It was actually a neighbour coming to jump in on the Trump debate. She'd heard me, and she was like, "I can't just leave this to this Canadian guy and this British guy. I've got to dive in here."
Yeah. Well, you know what? This is the thing with this whole situation too, is that everybody has an opinion. Everybody has an opinion. The Germans are talking about it. Everywhere you go, it has an opinion. To get back to a bit of the specifics of what you were saying of Trump sort of, towing the line a bit more. I mean, some of the stuff that he said, or tweeted, I mean, I follow him on Twitter just because it's mind-blowing. Yeah, it's mind-blowing, the shit that this guy says. But the first things that he was saying after the shooting was not great.
Yeah.
And, what really upsets me about it, and it's like, yeah, maybe he's starting to toe a bit of the line, but he's already been so divisive, with his language, in terms of it's us against them, it's Muslims against Americans, it's Mexicans against Americans, and that's really dangerous, I think, especially at this time where, you have this really, there's going to be a lot of people that are very emotional about, this attack, as you would expect. But the minute that you then start saying, hey, whose fault it is? Yeah. Or, whose fault it is? This group of people over here. So I think that's, obviously really dangerous. But I do agree with you in some sense that he's towing the line. And I think that once the Democratic National Convention is over and they have a candidate, like for sure, I know it's Hillary. They're saying it's Hillary, but Bernie Sanders is just hanging on there. God bless him.
Both in life and in votes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you'll see it start to swing back towards the middle, like both sides. Like the way that the American system works, where you're fighting for the nomination just within your party. People tend to really go crazy in pandering to the fringe elements of the party in order to win over the party. And then when they have to win the general election, they soften their stance. But again, can Trump soften from what he's already, declared?
Yeah, I'm not convinced he can. I think he's drawn a line in the sand. And as you said, once you start labeling, well, it's them. No matter what you're talking, there's good and bad in all walks of life. So suddenly then to alienate an entire group, what are you hoping to achieve with that? You can lock all the borders, you can build a wall, but you're not ever going to stop it. So, what's the next thing? Oh, okay, well, somebody from Florida's had an incident. Right, well, we're going to cut Florida off, and that's no longer part of the United States. Where do you stop?
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really good point, because it's like once you run out of foreign scapegoats, then who is it? And I was listening to a really interesting podcast. The guy, Dan Carlin, who does a really popular podcast, Hardcore History, he also does a sort of a common or current events show. And I really like his takes on a lot of the American politics. He is an American, but he's got sort of wacky ideas and sort of outsider views on a lot of things. It's an interesting podcast called Common Sense with Dan Carlin, if you want to check it out. But he was exactly talking about this, is that, as far as great empires go in history, they fall because of outside forces, so a gang of countries getting together and taking them down, or they tear themselves up from within.
Right.
And he was saying, we're getting really close to that happening in the U.S., because you're getting to the point where, they haven't even run out of the foreign scapegoats yet, but there's still the violence that's going on in small pockets, for sure, at some of these rallies, whether it's, the Trump rally and the Trump supporters getting on other people, or, Democratic, or mainly Bernie Sanders supporters, so they say, getting on with the Trump guys. And how do you walk back from that, whoever wins the election? So you've riled up all this hate against people that, it's not even that country versus us. It's people within our country, our own country, that we can't stand anymore. The States, they've had a civil war before, so I know that's 100 years ago, but I don't know. It seems like I'm not saying it's there yet, but it is. You get to this point where, say Trump wins, or say Bernie wins, or whatever. How do you walk back from, the guy that 2 weeks ago was your neighbor and had the Trump sign, and was hollering all this stuff while you were, hollering all the rest, and then you're supposed to just forget it all after the election and go back to, okay, well, I guess you're just Doug again from down the street, It doesn't
bury the hatchet, go have a beer and move on. Yeah, I guess it's also the division, as you said, it's the internal piece, but then it's also, as history would show, it's who you then ally yourself with or get into bed with from that point. The fact that, the North Korean leader is now saying, well, Trump is a guy that I can talk to. Surely that's got to be ringing some alarm bells out there. Not saying that, he's going to jump into bed with him, but, if then you start building alliances with nations or groups of people or organizations that, a large part of your internal population are in disagreement with, then you're heading on a slippery slope to some sort of internal struggle. Civil war may be a bit too far-fetched, but who knows in this day and age.
Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting. I mean, I've kind of said it before, that I did see. I mean, the States has had these kind of things before, where it was the Civil War, and then, race riots, in the 60s and the 70s, and then, the hippies versus the establishment, so they've kind of have this history and this sort of mentality of, division or struggle or something like this. And they'd kind of said, oh, we're past all that. We're finally this unified thing. And I think that this is obviously showing the cracks in that. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. It's really, really interesting. And it's kind of, I wonder, I haven't spoken with a lot of my friends back in Canada actually about this too much. And I wonder how much, I mean, I'm sure people are paying attention to it there. It's all over Canadian news, but I wonder if Canadians are maybe starting to feel the heat a little bit in terms of what does happen if this, our neighbor right down starts to go down in flames, because I mean, we're not the only country, Canada's not the only country that's really dependent on the US for a lot of things. I mean, the whole world will feel ripples from anything that happens in the US, but being right on the next door neighbor to the tire fire that would be,
I think
it'll be interesting.
Well, it'll be interesting if you're picking up on any of it in the German media, the German press. But here in the UK, I think the way it's being portrayed is, and obviously the media here is unbiased, but the way it's being portrayed is we're going from love him or hate him, and obviously I know he's not everyone's favourite, but you've got Obama that people see as actually, in inverted commas, an honest and trustworthy politician, somebody that's tried to do a lot of good and, an intelligent guy. And then you've got the opposite end of the spectrum of Trump coming in the way it's being portrayed in the British media is, wow, how can you go from poles apart in the space of 8 years? Is Obama really that hated? And I've got colleagues in the US that I speak to, and they're, I would say, very similar in their views to me, but they don't agree with what Obama's done. They don't believe that, there should be a society where, the rich pay more taxes to have those less fortunate, which for me is, a little bit mind-blowing, but, I respect their opinions. I don't live there. But it just seems amazing to me that, we are going from one pole to the other. And I think, if whoever is the president of the US is the leader of the free world, as the badge often gets thrown around, then does the international community get a vote? Because, if it is going to have an impact on all of us.
Well, I think that maybe the international community has a vote in terms of, it's like what they say, voting with your dollar, right? Like you don't have a direct vote in the election, but the European Union or groups of other countries could start to band together and say, you know what? Maybe we don't want all your bases, army, military bases in our country. Maybe we don't want, maybe we'll start to walk back a bit from our dependence on you as you start to decline. And this is one thing that I think Trump may have actually gotten right, is his view on some of the foreign policy. I mean, this is a guy that, let's remember, is really hard to actually get a read on what he actually thinks policy-wise, because he seemingly is just saying whatever the hell comes to his mind and, what's going to pander for more votes. But he does seem to have, and he has made a few comments that talk about, walking back the interventionism in the U.S. In U.S. foreign policy, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's about time that the U.S. stops being the world police and that people are so dependent on this, because then, you're seeing how dangerous it is, I guess, to put all your eggs in one basket. But maybe that's how the international community votes, is just saying, hey, you know what? Maybe we don't take your billions of dollars in aid, although that's really hard for some countries. They just don't. They have to do that, and then they're forced with doing kowtowing to whatever the U.S. says. But I mean, countries like Germany, like the UK, like some of the other European, powers. I mean, this is granted, hoping that the EU stays together, which we can segue to the next one. But, then you might actually, if you have a group of countries getting together, you might have something that maybe doesn't rival the US militarily, but, economically, or, can actually put enough pressure on them to be like, hey, listen, we're getting away from you guys. We're keeping our distance because this is too crazy. This is too much. And then maybe that just, it's like a flipping of what the U.S. has done for years of applying some political pressure back onto them and saying, you know what, until you get your human rights or your rhetoric or all this other crazy shit that your president is saying, till you get that under control, we're just going to step back from the table on a few things.
I think it's, and I do agree, why should America be the world police? Not that I disagree that they shouldn't be, but why should one nation rule all the others? Obviously, when Britain was an empire, then long may that continue. But
it was totally different.
Oh yeah, it's obviously it's totally different. It was fine.
Then it was all about tea.
Yeah,
it was just about tea.
Yeah, and that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. But yeah, do we take a step back from them doing that? But at what point do they take a step back, and are they willing to watch millions suffer or die or be tortured before that country then sorts itself out. And my worry is that won't happen. The international community won't stand for that. So, but is that the opportunity for the international community to pull together and have a world police or whatever made up of different nations? But
I mean, the U.S. they've never really intervened for humanitarian reasons. Like, come on. Like, they've really...
It's controversial. Next minute, you're going to be saying it's purely about oil, Flash. Surely not.
Or bananas or rubber or whatever, the tea, whatever it is. Let's be real here. A lot of the times the powers in charge aren't acting out of altruism.
It's a broad statement to make.
Unless they're forced to. I know I'm stating the obvious here, but yeah, I don't know. I just don't see it as like I could see, again, listening to this fella Dan Carlin that I mentioned. He kind of brought up some of those similar ideas and was saying, this migrant crisis that the EU is facing right now actually shows that, some of the European militaries, maybe were caught off guard, like the Coast Guards and the navies were caught off guard with dealing with these ships and the rescue efforts and stuff like that, but have since really sharpened their, response and stuff like that. And so it kind of shows proof of concept anyway that, what, these countries can, rise to the task in some of these areas if need be. And that just gives you the, again, proof of concept that maybe the U.S. doesn't need to be there all the time. Maybe they can back out. Now, when you have something like, the threat from Russia that some Eastern European countries are facing, they might not be ready to say, hey, yeah, you know what? Me and Lithuania and Ukraine and Poland, yeah, we're good enough. We'll just get together and we can handle it on our own. Don't worry, guys. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I guess that, and part of me was thinking of Russia. So when, obviously there's been a spate of airline tragedies the last 12 months or so, but the one that was allegedly shot down by a anti-aircraft missile that allegedly came from Russia or was supplied by Russia, then there was talk in Europe of, well, effectively, if Ukraine were part of NATO, that's an attack on a NATO member. Therefore, the whole of NATO are legally obliged to respond.
Yeah.
Then, that gets scary. But then if you go back to the migrant piece with, the Coast Guards being cut off watch, I think that's a great example of Europe eventually, and they were terrible to start with, to the detriment of people dying, which is horrendous. Eventually Europe pulled together and, now they're starting to work together. Whereas originally it was all the individual states. Well, we're going to put up a fence and we're just going to push them over the border to the next country and pass the buck along. Whereas now they are starting to pull together. Now, as we've already just alluded to, potentially later in this month, the UK vote as to whether they want to stay in Europe. That then has a significant impact because obviously the UK does plough a lot of money into Europe and provide a lot of resource. So, yeah, it'll be interesting on a smaller scale to see whether that, the UK vote is a representation of the US pulling back from greater things. Yeah, interesting times for the world ahead.
Well, I wonder if I think it's a common thing. You can draw comparisons to what is happening in the U.S. I mean, the sentiment that people are feeling of like wanting to close the borders and wanting to kind of become more isolationist. From what I gather in the UK, the argument for leaving the European Union is being framed around very similar arguments again, anti-immigration and, sort of we can not tying ourselves to other people. Let's do this on our own. And I mean, similar sentiments are kind of coming in other European countries too. Sort of the rise of this, they're calling it the far right, nationalist movement. So it seems to be something that's sweeping across the board. And it's probably a, perfect storm of factors, the war in Syria, the migrant crisis, economic issues, since 2008 on, that is sort of creating this, but it's it's unsettling to see that when shit gets a little rough and sort of hits the fan, everyone's sort of jumping into their own boat and, not rather than pooling together and rising to the challenge. But
yeah, I think the EU one will be an interesting one. So I'm not historically the biggest political brain and knowledge, and I don't really.
You don't say.
Yeah, based on some of my comments today, that might surprise you. But of the last few months, for various reasons, been dragged in. The whole debate going on here in the UK regarding the EU referendum is an absolute shitstorm, to be honest. There's facts just being thrown out by either side, some of which may be true, some of which may not be. Whoever brings the facts out, the other people just tear them apart and say, well, they're not true. Nobody really seems to know the implications, what would happen if we vote to leave. It's just really interesting to me. Normally when there's an election or something, there's, here's our manifesto and, we're going to plough this into education. We're going to make some savings here and that'll free up money for whatever. And the other side contests that. But there's usually some facts and give and take. Whereas this side, it just seems to be whoever shouts the loudest and makes out the most outrageous claims is going to get away with it. And my worry is that the average person on the street, and I put my hand up, I'm one of those average people, are just going to listen to the facts that appeal to me and use that to cast my vote, as opposed to delving in, because there isn't anywhere where you can go, I don't think, that I've found to get concise information. Every day through my letterbox, I'm getting like 5 or 6 different pamphlets from the Leave or the Remain campaign, all giving totally different, world apart views on what will happen. And I think ultimately it's going to come down to 2 or 3 key issues, and I think one of them that you've touched on is the immigration piece. And the average person on the street is going to say, well, no, let's shut our borders and let's make Britain British again, which to me doesn't work. That's, I believe there need to be some financial curtails on some of the immigration piece. Us, like any other country, isn't a bottomless pot of money, so we need to manage that financially responsibly. But conversely, we can't just shut the doors. That's just not going to work in this day and age.
No, I agree. I mean, we're such a global society that you can't just pick and choose when you want to have movement and have, we want, to have access to your markets and everything else, but you can't come here, and it doesn't make any sense. I think we're too far beyond that. This is gonna have to be a bit of a short episode to start. I have to run and integrate into German culture and watch the Euro 2016 football match.
And drink beer and eat sausages, surely, if you're fully integrating into the culture.
Oh, yeah. No, I plan very much to have a bratwurst tonight and at least a couple of those giant steins of beer. So.
Good. I'm wearing lederhosen, and you've got the makings of a mullet there already.
Yeah, exactly. I did want to just sort of, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, I guess, and editorialize, but I really liked what you just kind of commented there on how it's who shouts the loudest, and that this Brexit campaign is seemingly devoid of facts and solid, any sort of solid sustenance on either side. And I think that's, again, like, wrapping it all up of like what, Donald Trump, I think, embodies that. He doesn't have any substance. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He just says things and says outlandish things, and it's riding on emotion. It's fueling emotion, which is not a great way to do your politics or to do anything really. Obviously there's a place for emotion in human society, but when we're making decisions, we gotta, think about these things more. And it's interesting that, I think this sort of really sets the stage for sort of what this show is probably going to be talking about. And one of the reasons I think why we kind of started it was to, maybe delve a little bit deeper ourselves, force ourselves to do that so that we have something to talk about, and, we can try and outwit and outsmart each other and sound smarter, so that the listeners are on our side. But I think it's a good exercise, and it seems more and more in the way of the world as, people do. They just log onto the internet and they hear what they want to hear. They find the fact that reinforces their opinion, and there you go.
Yeah, what's the fact that I've seen banded around this week by one of the managers of my company, that the average human attention span is 8 seconds. You've got 8 seconds to make that impression and catch them, and that's what they take away from it. Now,
what? Sorry?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas the average attention span of a goldfish, stereotypically always seen as the animal with the lowest attention span, is actually 9 seconds. So we're actually a second below the goldfish. But it is that soundbite. Whoever shouts the loudest, that's what you're going to remember, and you go to cast your vote, and that's going to make the difference.
Well, this is where I think, Brad, you and I could maybe be a benefit to society with our show here.
What you mean?
We'll delve a little deeper.
Oh, I thought you were going to say we just turn the volume up.
Yeah, we could do that too.
And just shout really loud, and then well, we could be president.
Yeah, well, we need more. Okay, I'm making notes of this right now. More inflammatory remarks. Perhaps a touch more cursing.
And we need to ostracize at least either one religious group or race of people.
All right, I'm not so comfortable with that right now, but I could easily start with sports teams.
Wow, that moves us on perfectly. Very quickly, I'd love to get your view of what it's been like for a Canadian living through the start of the Euro 2016 soccer to those Americans listening, football tournament, and to get your impression of what's it been like. Have you had much experience with it yet, or other than going for a beer tonight?
This is good. I'll use our last 5 minutes. Well, probably not all of it, but I'll give you my impressions. I was happy to see that amidst, all this political stuff that we were talking about and the violence associated with it, I was happy to see the news in Europe shift to the good old soccer hooliganism. The English have arrived in France and are mucking it up with the Russians, although the Russians seem really hell-bent on taking the hooligan crown away from the English.
So if you go back to the 80s, the English ruled the football hooligan world. We were the kings of that. We dominated. It was a really interesting article on the BBC News the other day where they were interviewing it was a member of the Russian government. It was an MP in Russia, and he was basically saying that the new breed of Russian hooligans are stronger and fitter than all that have gone before them, including the English. The English were their mentors, but now they've honed it. But they also are stronger and fitter because they train in boxing and martial arts, and they eat healthy, and they're not fueled by alcohol. He said the problem with the Brits is they're only fueled by alcohol, and therefore they drunk and they can't run away and they fall asleep mid hooliganism. It's just like, really?
Yeah, I read a very similar piece. So you know what? Good for them. They lost to Slovakia, so they might even be out of the tournament within the first stages. So we might not even get to see the true, how hooligan-y they could really be if they made it to the final. But let's remember too that this is just a warm up for them for when they host the World Cup in 2018. I don't think any fans will be traveling to Russia to enjoy the games. But my other impression of Euro 2016 so far is it's in Canada. We obviously get really passionate about hockey, and you see it. You don't see the level of hooliganism and stuff.
Well, no, you normally see that on the ice.
Yeah, I think maybe that's why it's the fighting gets done on the ice, but it is a different level of fandom, I think, here. And no disrespect to Canadian fans, it's a different thing, but when you go to a hockey game, and I almost said a hockey match, I'm becoming European, this is ridiculous. In the playoffs or something, it's loud. It's really loud. It's crazy. But, you get maximum, 17, 20,000 people. What I've seen here I haven't been to the stadiums yet, but just the vibe of it, it's just on such a bigger scale. And it doesn't matter what game, people are invested. They're crazy. they're loving it. I love how it's sort of taken over just the everyday life. I was in Budapest a couple days ago. The Hungarians were playing. You know, even when the Hungarians weren't playing, every restaurant had a TV pulled out onto, even if it was just on some rickety looking cart out onto the sidewalk. People were gathering around. It's like nonstop coverage. I know, you know, there's probably some people out there that are just like, you know, was this really money well spent, you know, sports, and it's corrupt and the rest of it. But you know what? I think it's a blast. I think it's great. I really hope Germany moves on a couple rounds. Ooh. Because, hey, I'm here and I want to experience it. I want to see it firsthand. If it was anything like the Hungarians after they beat Austria yesterday or 2 days ago, that was a sight to see. And I guess before we started, you did fill me in. It might have something to do with Hungary being they consume the most alcohol in the EU.
I think they're second to the Czech Republic of alcohol per capita. So yeah, that could have something to do with it. But you know, as the Russians said, you know, the Brits are fueled by alcohol as well. So you know, we're not going to be left behind.
Well, I'm excited to get out there and experience it. And when we get together next, I'll report back as to how it's going and how I'm finding, if I've completely assimilated or not.
I'd definitely be interested to hear your take on it, to see how you felt. Football isn't my favourite sport, but it is definitely a sport that does pull everyone together. And when you bump in, you know, when I travel the world and you get into a taxi, I don't speak any other language other than English or American. Someone said that's a different language altogether. But you get into a taxi, and I remember getting into a taxi in Italy once, and the driver didn't speak a word of English. I didn't speak a word of Italian, but we somehow had this conversation about the World Cup that was going on at the time and how Italy were doing terribly, but England were doing even worse. Yet somehow we got through that 20-minute journey. We both understood, or at least I hope I understood, what we were saying. So it is a sport that crosses all borders. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's great. I'm really looking forward to it. And with that, I'm going to have to run. So, hey, you know what? This is first episode. I thought we, you know, touched on things and, you know, maybe set the tone. Yeah. I imagine it's going to change a lot, where every day is going to be different. So,
yeah, and I would.
If people listening didn't like this, well, you know, screw you. You can find another podcast.
Well, yeah, that said, or, you know, feel free to reach out to us. We're both on Twitter. So my Twitter handle, Bradley W. Hayes, all one word. You know, be polite in your feedback. Give some feedback. And Flash, I know you're on Twitter. Do you want to give your handle?
Yeah. I'm at B Van Paradon, all one as well. Yeah, no. We'd love to get some feedback, and like I said, I think the topics are going to be wide ranging and diverse on here. So yeah, we're going to try and dig a little deeper and maybe find the weird stuff too. I got a head transplant story that I'm waiting to drop on you.
Ooh. So that's something I'd love to see over the medium of Skype that we're using right now.
All right, my friend. I will see you next time.
Take care and enjoy tonight.
Sounds good. Thanks, buddy.
Cheers.